Hello and welcome to yet another video. This is the first episode of the story, in which 3rd Hokage Sarutobi Hiruzen transports Naruto to an alternate universe where Minato is still alive. Soon, Minato begins to regard this Naruto from another universe as his own son. Will Minato, from the alternate universe, return Naruto to his original universe? This story is from Random Flyer. Please support him, her. Please like and subscribe to show your support. Let's get the show started. Sarutobi ran through the lowest halls of the Hokage Tower, the pitter-patter of smaller feet barely keeping up with his hurried speed. He clutched the smaller hand in his in case those feet should falter so he would not lose the boy in his haste. Around him, shinobi were rushing through the halls and different rooms. Flashes of light burst from file rooms as important documents were first copied onto portable scrolls then destroyed. Others were heading out to help with the defenses. Sarutobi himself should have been heading that way as well. It was the Hokage's duty to defend the village with his life and he had no intention on ignoring that duty, but there was another, equally important duty trailing along behind him. The walls shook and the lighting flicked a moment as another explosion rocked through the village. The old Hokage looked up to the ceiling briefly wondering if he would have to worry about it collapsing, but just as quickly dismissed the idea. The attacks were not close or strong enough yet to break or destroy the stronghold. The explosions themselves were still worrying, though, and he could almost hear in his mind's ear the screams of villagers not yet evacuated and the cries of his shinobi defending their home. He sped up his pace, this time making the child behind him stumble and fall. For a moment, Sarutobi was dragging the boy. The younger desperately tried to regain his footing and stifle the whimpers and curses alternating out of his mouth, but the old man swung the child onto his hip without breaking stride and continued on his way. Through the boy's thin white t-shirt he could feel warm dampness seeping into his battle clothes. Luckily, the wound was not life-threatening and the boy would heal so long as he was given time and wasn't further injured. They turned a corner and moved into a darker passage, this one almost completely deserted and with fewer doors, most of which were hidden from the casual observer. Sarutobi's steps did not falter as he moved to one of those doors, invisible to all unless previously aware of its presence and coded into the protective seals that surrounded the door and room beyond. A few hand motions deactivated the seals and he slid inside. The boy felt limp in his arms, though still conscious. Moving around had not done any favors for his wound, and blood loss combined with emotional turmoil was putting the boy into a state of shock. The old man wished he could do something to relieve the child's distress, but there was no time. With a quick hand sign, he brought one of the chakra-sensitive candles to life, throwing the room into eerie shadows and half-light. There was only one object in this room besides the candles. It was designated a S-class secret and only a few besides the Hokage even knew of its existence, much less had seen it, and fewer than even that had actually used it. In fact, the total number of people even seeing it in use was the Sandaime Hokage and Shikaku, his Umbu advisor. Sarutobi had never actually used it for the purpose he now intended, but it was the best and most assured way to ensure the safety of the young Uzumaki Naruto now huddled in his arms. He set the boy down, quicker than he should have with the bleeding wound on the child's side. The sudden jolt brought the boy around, though, so Sarutobi quashed any feelings of remorse on his part. He drew out a scroll set with a complex seal designed by himself and his student, Jiraiya, and unfolded their creation until it lay flat on the floor immediately before the wide pane of crystal glass standing in the center of the room. "Naruto," Sarutobi said, calling the boy out of his semi-dazed state where he swayed next to the Hokage. "Old man, what's going on?" Naruto's voice was quiet, very different from the 8-year-old's typical boisterous tones. "The village is being attacked," Sarutobi said against his better judgment. He was taking too long as it was, too long away from the front lines. "You are one of the goals of this attack, so I'm going to send you somewhere I believe you will be safe." "Safe?" Naruto repeated, a spark of his usual life coming into his eyes, "But I can no," Sarutobi cut him off, harsher than ever before and grabbing the boy's shoulders tightly. You're still just an academy student, years away from graduation. You will do as I say. Now look at me. Naruto started at the harsh tone, but there was no time to bring about greater understanding in the boy. He obediently looked up to Sarutobi's face and the old man caught his eyes weaving a genjutsu through the boy. Naruto's pupils dilated slightly and glazed as his shoulders relaxed. Sarutobi gave his instructions in a clear and authoritative tone. Naruto, I want you to memorize this seal. The boy's eyes immediately swung down to the large paper unfolded before them, sweeping across the design, taking every symbol and character with skill he would not have had on his own. Sarutobi watched as the eyes scanned the seal 3 complete times before turning back to him. This seal will bring you home when the time comes. Do not use it unless you have clear proof I have personally contacted you and told you it is safe to return. If it is truly safe to return, I will give you the hand seals at that time. Do you understand? Sarutobi asked, though it was unnecessary. The instructions would bury themselves into the boy's memory along with the seal thanks to the genjutsu. It would lay in the boy's subconscious to hide the seal from anyone forcibly trying to find it where he sent the boy. Then, when it was necessary, Sarutobi would be able to call it out again. Naruto still nodded at the end of the instructions, his eyes locked on Sarutobi's in a sort of glazed fascination. Good, Sarutobi said, releasing the boy from the genjutsu and turning his attention back to the seal and crystal glass before them. Naruto blinked and swayed next to him, looking around in confusion and disorientation for a moment. He was pale and his blood from his wound had stained his white shirt and darkened the red swirl printed on the front. Old man? He asked again, this time with more fear and confusion in his tone than before. Sarutobi didn't bother answering, instead focusing on the hand seals required to activate the crystal glass. The crystal before them glowed for a moment before fading to reveal a room not too dissimilar than the one they were currently in, except in that room, no one was present. Grabbing Naruto's arm, the old Hokage moved the boy into the center of the seal and began hand seals again. Activating the seal took a considerable number of hand signs and he ran through them as quickly as he could, knowing he had spent too much time there already. The seal on the floor glowed blue, the symbols and characters moved to circle the boy and creep up his legs and body. Naruto stared in wide-eyed fascination and fear, unable to move and face pale white. Sarutobi regretted causing the child so much distress, but there was little choice. When the writing had completely left the page and covered the boy from head to foot, he moved forward and with a powerful shove pushed the boy forward through the crystal glass. His hands stopped at the crystal surface, themselves, unable to pass through, but the boy fell with a hard thump on to the floor beyond. Sarutobi waited a second longer to make sure Naruto had made the journey safely, but as soon as he saw the boy's arm twitch feebly he shut down the crystal glass, returning it to his own semi-transparent reflection. The additional light in the room faded to just the candle again and the old man turned to the door. He sealed the room, adding a few additions of his personal security seals to ensure none but himself could enter or even discover the place if worse came to worse. Then, without another look back, he turned to the hallway and hurried to join the battle still raging outside. The discovery of the mirror had been entirely by accident. Minato had been trying to figure out how the old man had done his magic-seeing crystal trick. It had been useful to his predecessor to keep track of the goings-on in the village and Minato made no secret of his envy of that ability. He made it his off-hours project, something to keep him busy in the off chance he didn't have paperwork cluttering his desk or after the Hokage Tower closed regular operations for the night. It was better than going to an empty house and dwelling on past memories. Unfortunately, the Sandaime left no directions on how he had created his seeing crystal and no amount of tinkering from Minato could make the faded orb come to life again. So he decided to start from page 1 and build his own. He knew it was possible, had seen the end result once when the older man had been feeling indulgent and showed him how he seemed to know everything that happened with the walls of his city. Minato just had to deconstruct how such a thing was possible. It gave him something to occupy his time and mind in the dead of night. No one could have felt more surprised than him when one day, while running one of his experimental prototypes through its initial trial phase, Minato found himself staring into the face of his predecessor. At first, Minato thought he had opened a window into the past. He refused to let himself think he was looking at the afterlife. The ramifications of that were too painful to conceive. Then, he'd looked closer at the equally surprised face gazing back at him, and he realized the Sandame's face was older, more lined, wearier than he'd ever seen before. "Minato," the Sandame gasped in shock, bringing the Yondaime out of his own shocked silence. "Sandaime-sama?" Minato responded with equal amazement. How is this possible? The older Hokage wondered, unknowingly echoing Minato's thoughts, and the younger said so, drawing a frown from the older man. "I don't think you realize, Minato-kun, that you're dead." That caused Minato to stop, stunned for a moment. "I can say the same thing about you," he finally replied, earning a considering look from the Sandame. In the end, both Hokage put their heads together and determined they were peering into a different eventuality, alternatives to their own worlds if things had played out differently. It was fascinating for Minato to learn of some of the differences that separated their worlds, if a little painful at times and frustrating at others, especially when the Sandame refused to answer some of his questions. They determined the main difference between their two worlds occurred during the Kyuubi's attack almost a decade before. In Minato's own world, the Kyuubi had been dragged into death by his beloved Kushina shortly after she had given birth to their stillborn son. Dissimilarly, he discovered his alternate self had died sealing the Kyuubi in a new Jinchuriki, following his wife to the grave. Minato wasn't sure if he envied his alternate self or not. Still, being able to talk to the Sandame, even if wasn't his own, was an immense comfort to Minato. It was incredible, the similarities between the two. If he hadn't known better, Minato would have thought he was speaking to his own predecessor. The only noticeable difference he could see was the man's increased age as well as the increased weariness that seemed settled around him like a cloak. Minato wasn't sure how he felt when the Sandame said the same thing about him. Nevertheless, both Hokage were well aware of the potential uses of such a thing and more than aware of the potential misuses. Minato designated it an S-class secret, and though the Sandame never said specifically, he was sure the old man had done the same. They speculated about the possibility of sending something or someone through the glass. Minato couldn't help himself from theorizing and discussing his ideas with the older man, but refrained from actively trying it. The potential for misuse was too great. The crystal glass was kept in a high-security room in the Hokage Tower. Minato's footsteps echoed around him as he headed down to the lower level where it was located. He wanted to check if the Sandame would be up for a talk. It was late and most everyone had headed home already, but he didn't want to return to the house just yet. Both Hokage tended to keep late hours, it was part of the job, so he had a chance of catching his colleague before the Sandame left for the night. They were lucky the time between the two worlds corresponded so well. There was another reason he wanted to speak with the Sandame in that other place. Minato was growing concerned for his fellow Hokage. The Sandame was looking increasingly worn and tired, worry lines visibly deepening in the short amount of time they had been in contact. The old man had vaguely mentioned some problems, political mostly, both inside and out of the village, but would not go into any detail on the subject. The Yondaime frowned to himself as he made his way down to the room housing the seeing glass. Though his predecessor had tried to reassure him, Minato was only growing more concerned. It didn't help that the Sandame was increasingly too busy to join in their nightly talks. Altogether it left one worried Hokage. Even with the concern and the expectation of something bad on the horizon, Minato was not prepared to enter the crystal's room and find a young body lying on the floor before the seeing crystal. He stopped, stunned, for a moment before he rushed to the boy's side. There was a dark stain on the boy's white shirt and sticky pool of blood half dried on the floor. Heart in his stomach, Minato searched for the wound leaking out the red substance. He found one injury, a painful slash mark across the boy's side, but the injury looked at least half a day old, too old to have caused the semi-fresh pool beneath the boy. He found no other wounds, and though the half-dried blood posed something of a mystery, Minato dismissed it in favor of looking after the boy. He was not in immediate danger, but the boy was suffering from shock, low chakra and blood. Carefully, Minato lifted the child in his arms. He glanced at the crystal standing blank and quiet next to them. As outrageous as it seemed, the only explanation he could provide for how the boy got into the room was through the glass. He doubted it was an accident, which meant the Sandaime must have sent the boy through somehow. Frowning, the Yondaime turned his back to the crystal and moved back out into the dim hallway. He reset the protective seals and added a few more to keep things in as well as out. It wouldn't do to assume the Sandaime was the only one in that other place who could get to the mirror, and if one person had come through there was no guarantee more wouldn't follow. There was no way to know the situation in that other place. Something disastrous might have happened. Glancing down at the light bundle in his arms before rushing back toward the surface and hospital, Minato revised that thought in his head. Something disastrous had more than likely happened. Pushing through the doors into the hospital, Minato was more than relieved it was so late. There were few people at the medical center, and anyone who was there was either too busy and tired, attending patients, or too distressed worrying for loved ones to take much note of him as he waylaid a nurse to tend to the boy. "Of course, Hokage-sama," the girl stammered, blinking at him with wide, surprised eyes. "Please, bring him this way, sir." She led him through the halls to an empty room with a single bed. Following her gesture to the ready-made bed, Minato laid the boy down on it, carefully settling the limp form in a hopefully comfortable position. Looking between the two of them for a moment, the nurse hesitated before asking, "Is he related to you, Hokage-sama?" Minato blinked at her, then looked down at the child, then blinked at the mop of blonde hair that stuck up in all directions. He'd been so busy, first with his preoccupation with what could be happening in the other world and then with getting the boy treatment, he hadn't even noticed. Looking now, though, his gut twisted slightly and Minato felt sure something more was going on than he was aware. Swallowing the feeling and looking back at the nurse still hovering just beyond the bed, Minato asked with an edge, "Does it make a difference?" Starting, the nurse quickly shook her head and moved to the bedside. "Of course not." Finally snapping into her professional role, she began scanning the boy, a slight frown on her face. Minato waited off to the side. He wanted to know how the boy was doing. From the looks of the child, he seemed only 7 years old, maybe a little younger, but Minato could not ignore the similarities in their appearance. The longer he looked at the boy, the more he felt that was how his son would appear, minus the strange whisker marks on the child's cheeks. If his son had lived, he would be just over 8 years old now. Once the idea took hold, Minato found it impossible to ignore. He had assumed his son had died in the other world as well. After all, the old man had never once mentioned the boy, but that was no guarantee. Half of him wanted to go back to the crystal, contact the Sandaime, and demand an explanation. Considering his earlier luck with that, however, and the condition of the boy lying only a few feet away from him, he doubted he would have any luck getting a response from that other world. Instead, Minato stuck with the other desire tugging at him. He'd wait until the boy woke up. They had over half the night and he was willing to stay there for the rest of it if necessary. He'd even stay through the morning into the next day. Mundane forms and mission reports could wait for as long as needed as far as he was concerned. A troubled hum from the nurse brought Minato out of his thoughts. "What's the problem?" Minato asked, moving closer to the bed. "He's healing at an accelerated rate," the nurse replied, a confused frown marring the concentration on her face. "It's almost like there's a foreign chakra in his system." "Foreign chakra?" Minato repeated, looking to the nurse then back to the boy. "Is it harming him?" "It seems to be the cause of the accelerated healing, but I'm not sure. I've never seen anything like this before." She paused, eyes closed and concentration focused for several more minutes. It doesn't seem to be hurting him. Until we know what it is, I recommend we do nothing. Minato frowned, but nodded at her advice. As skilled as he was in many areas, healing was not his specialty, and he knew when to bow to the advice of a professional. Still, he didn't like the idea of this foreign chakra. He'd find Rin or Tsunade in the morning and have them do a more thorough checkup. The nurse let the glowing green chakra fade from her hands. Other than that, he isn't in any danger. If the healing keeps up at this rate, he'll probably be physically healed in another day. Minato nodded, staring intently at the child. That meant the boy would probably be awake relatively soon if there wasn't additional mental trauma keeping the boy unconscious. An intake of breath brought his attention back to the nurse. Hokage-sama, could you help me get him into a gown? His clothes are ruined. Oh, of course. If you'll get the gown, I'll get these off, he said, moving to a better position. The nurse moved to the door, smiling back at him. Thank you, Hokage-sama, and don't worry about saving them. They're beyond hope at this point, I think. Yes, they are, Minato agreed, but she was already in the hallway. Pulling out a kunai, he carefully cut up the sleeves and front of the shirt. Then, he lifted the boy and gently tugged the ruined garment away in one motion. When he settled the boy back onto the bed, he froze. On the child's stomach there was a large, intricate seal. It pulsed deep black at a regular beat, probably the boy's heartbeat, and faded into the skin again. Just looking at it, Minato recognized his own work. He'd developed that seal years ago, one of the most powerful seals he had devised, though there had been some minor changes to it in the example scrawled into the boy's stomach. He would have to look into it in greater detail later to determine the exact purposes of the changes. As to the general reason, he had no doubt the seal was the cause of the foreign chakra present in the boy's system. He had a strong suspicion on what that was and what was sealed in the boy, but hesitant to jump to any half-formed conclusions. The door opened as the nurse returned with loose-fitting hospital pants and shirt. Minato turned and intercepted her before she could cross to the bed. I'll take care of this, he said with a smile, and he took the hospital pajamas. I'm sure you have other duties to attend to. It's no trouble. Hokage-sama, the nurse replied, a little surprised. No, I found the boy, I feel responsible for him, Minato said, kindly but firmly. Thank you for looking at him. Oh, it was my pleasure, Hokage-sama, the nurse said, beaming at him with new confidence. You're so kind to take care of him. You'll make such a good father someday. Minato bit back a sigh as he subtly led the woman to the door. Thank you. If I need anything else, I'll be sure to call. Anything at all, the nurse agreed, pausing just outside the door. Oh, you never said, what's the boy's name? Minato stopped his gentle pushing. I'm not sure, he admitted, a little embarrassed. He was unconscious when I found him. Well, I'm sure he'll wake up in a few hours. You can find out then and let us know at the front desk. I'll do that, Minato mumbled, glancing back to the bed. He closed the door, not noticing if the nurse had said anything else or was even still there. He hadn't thought about the boy's name. A part of him had just subconsciously started thinking of the boy as Naruto, but what was his name? What if his name really was Naruto? Minato didn't know how he would react to that, how he would feel about that. Shaking the thought from his mind, Minato crossed back to the bed. The seal still pulsed in a steady rhythm, deep and black one moment and fading the next. Wetting some gauze from the supply cabinet and grabbing some bandages, he cleaned the blood away and disinfected what was left of the wound. He pulled out a scroll from his pouch along with pen and ink. Then, slowly, he copied the seal, pausing when it faded to make sure he was accurate. 10 minutes later he had checked and rechecked the completed seal. The scroll went back into his pouch and he carefully dressed the injury and changed the boy into the hospital pajamas. With nothing left to do, Minato pulled a chair up to the bedside and collapsed into it. His eyes burned and his head ached. He only wanted to lean his head back, close his eyes, and sleep, but his thoughts were racing. He didn't know what time it was, but he could guess it was very late from the dark and still world outside. The child in front of him slept peacefully. The color had returned to his cheeks and his breathing was deep and even. Minato watched the small chest rise and fall, thoughts restless yet too tired to focus on any of them. He leaned back, stretched out his legs and crossed his arms over his chest. He blinked heavily as the steady, soft breathing filled the room, lulling his restlessness. Before he realized what was happening, his eyes slid closed and he dropped off to sleep. Minato awoke to a faint rustling sound, then a faint clicking sound. His first thought was to curse himself for not closing the window, causing the wind to rattle the vertical blinds. Then, he realized he hadn't left the window open. Slowly, silently groaning at his lost sleep, he opened his eyes, realizing with a flash of panic that the figure on the bed was gone. No, not gone, just kneeling upon the bed, half hidden by blinds. As he looked out the window, the pale light of early dawn filtering in behind him. Minato sighed as he tried to still his suddenly racing heart. The spike of adrenaline slowly left his system, leaving him wide awake in its place. The boy, by this time, had turned and was staring at him with wide, blue eyes. Minato's own eyes, and for a moment the man couldn't remove his gaze from the child's before him. The reflection of his own eyes held him completely speechless, and he had difficulty fighting the sudden bubble of emotion that welled up in his chest. "Hi," the boy said brightly, if with a little hesitance. Minato blinked, coming back to himself and that sky-blue gaze. "Hi," he responded, desperately using the moment to collect himself. "How are you feeling?" "Great," the boy chirped, a wide smile on his face, and Minato couldn't help but smile back, but the boy's grin faltered after a moment before saying in more subdued tone, "But I think I had a strange dream last night." He glanced toward the window again, doubt shining in his eyes. Minato hesitated. "What did you dream?" he finally asked, leaning forward in his seat and resting his elbows on his knees. The boy didn't answer right away. Instead, the eyes narrowed slightly and Minato found himself on the other side of a scrutinizing and vaguely suspicious look. He tried to project himself as friendly as possible, smiling a harmless and open grin, but wasn't sure how well he succeeded. The grin felt a little strained against the butterflies that had suddenly flared to life in his stomach at seeing that mirroring blue-eyed gaze. "Where's old man Hokage?" the boy asked, completely ignoring Minato's question. Now it was Minato's turn to pause as he deliberated his answer. "He's not here," he finally said. It was easy to tell whom the boy was referring to and, by the nature of the question, that Minato wasn't going to get as much information on what had happened as he originally hoped. Still, he could learn some things, like whether this boy was another version of his own son, a version of his son who had survived past birth. Just the thought of the possibility sitting before him made the butterflies in Minato's stomach whirl faster. He had to clear his throat before he could ask the next question. "Can you tell me what your name is?" The boy looked up after having fallen into his own silent reverie. A wide smile split his face again and he bounced a little where he sat on the bed. "I'm Naruto," he said with pride, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Uzumaki Naruto. What's your name?" Minato felt the air rush out of his chest. The butterflies now felt like a full-blown maelstrom whipping through him and turning everything he knew upside down. It took a moment to draw in a full breath again, and even that had more of a wheezing quality to it. Hey mister." Naruto's tenor voice slowly filtered into Minato's conscious. He blinked, realizing the boy was waving a small hand in front of his face. "Are you alright, mister?" Naruto asked, peering at him, head tilted. "You look kinda pale." "I'm fine," Minato managed to squeeze out, though even to his own ears he sounded anything but. Naruto scrunched up his nose in clear confusion and disbelief, looking entirely too much like Kushina for Minato's heart to take at the moment. He drew in a ragged breath, but it didn't seem to help. The room still held precious little air. Some distant part of his mind told him to pull it together, but looking up at his sun again made that thought impossible. Without realizing he was moving, Minato stood up and turned toward the door. "I just need some air," he said as he hurried out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him and Minato fell back against it, eyes closed, and head falling into his shaking hands. He was trembling, breath coming in ragged gasps as he attempted to regain air in his lungs. Sliding down to the hallway floor, he rested his elbows on his knees, face still in his hands. Images of the small, poisoned body of his son, killed by the Kyuubi's chakra before even given a chance at life, and his spent and broken wife bubbled unwillingly to the surface. The memory of what had happened and the sight of what could have been clashed, dredging up the same pain he'd felt the last time he saw his wife and the only time he saw his son. He was vaguely grateful it was still so early in the morning and the hospital was relatively deserted. It wouldn't do to have some hapless citizen come upon their Hokage having a breakdown in the hallway. XXXXX. The door clicked closed behind the strange man as he rushed from the room, and for a moment Naruto could only stare, smile slowly falling from his face. Several minutes went by and still the man didn't return. Naruto's gaze drifted to the rumpled bed spread in front of him, frown tugging at his lips. He didn't know why everyone seemed to hate him so much. They only had to see his face, hear his name, and the cold glare entered their eyes, or they refused to look at him and left him alone. He didn't know why and, worse, he didn't know what to do about it, except become Hokage, and that was so very far off. Naruto had held a lot of hope for that blonde man. He was the second person to wait for Naruto to wake up at the hospital, so naturally Naruto hoped the man would feel differently about him. But no, as soon as he'd said his name the man had left, like all the others, looking upset, and it didn't seem like the man would be back. He was left alone again. Sighing, Naruto glanced back to the window, shifting around to get a better view at the pre-dawn village. It didn't matter, he decided to himself. He'd wait for the old man to get back from wherever he'd gone, and then he'd camp himself in the Hokage's office and force the leader to spend some time with him. Maybe he'd paint a large portion of the village, then the Sandaime would have to see him if only to rebuke him. He chuckled to himself, picturing the familiar scene in his head, only to have a thoughtful frown take over his expression again. There was an itch in the back of his head, a thought he couldn't quite remember, but that didn't want to fade. Thinking of the Sandaime only made it worse, like a persistent visitor that wouldn't go away, or his landlord and the rent was due knocking at his door. Yet, no matter how much he tried to grasp it, it slipped away, sliding under the surface to reappear elusive as ever. The more he tried the harder it became and the more persistent it was. With another explosive sigh, Naruto threw himself back against the bed, arms spread wide in frustration. He glared into the air before him. It was like a fly he couldn't swat. He shook his head back and forth, giving up the fight and hoping if he ignored it the half-thought would go away. It didn't, but that didn't stop Naruto from trying. He could be stubborn with the best of them. In trying not to think about the half-thought he couldn't think, his mind turned back to the nightmare he'd just had, the one that had woken him to his current situation in the hospital. Naruto hadn't understood what was going on, all he knew was he woke up to distant shouts out in the village and the occasional explosion rocking through the night. Looking out his window, there were flames rising from the outskirts of town, staining the night in orange light. Out in the street civilians slowly gathered, pointing toward the escalating battle and calling to each other in frightened voices. Several started hurrying toward the shelter buried deep in the Hokage mountain, even though no shinobi were around to direct them to do so. A few in the street made sharp gestures toward his window, and though it was too dark to make out their faces, Naruto could picture the angry expressions and quickly drew back into his room. He bit his lip as another explosion and burst of flame flashed through the night sky. He ran to the door and double-checked the deadbolt. He wanted to go to the shelter or, better yet, the Hokage tower, knowing from experience the door wouldn't hold long if necessary, but he was scared to head out into the streets with the growing number of frightened and angry villagers present. Naruto was still trying to decide what to do when the window shattered, exploding into the room as a figure burst through. It was thanks to the last 2 years of academy training and dodging ANBU after playing innumerable pranks that he was able to avoid the grab for him. For a moment, Naruto caught sight of the headband as the scant light from the window caught it, 4 vertical lines with a single horizontal slash through them. Then, he had to move again to keep from being cornered. A few more close calls and the intruder got angry, cursing under their breath as they drew out a kunai. Naruto dove for the door, but undoing the lock gave the other the opportunity to cut a deep slash across Naruto's side. He fell to the ground, Payne shooting through him. Instead of killing him, the shinobi hoisted him over their shoulder and retreated out the window of the destroyed room. The rough handling only worsened the pain in his side and soon Naruto was feeling dizzy. He made one last desperate attempt, managing to grab a kunai from the shinobi's pouch and jamming the pointed edge into his kidnapper's back. The enemy cried out in pain and tripped, sending them both tumbling onto a rooftop. Naruto staggered to his feet and desperately searched for a way down, but he could hear the other cursing and knew his time was up. A sharp clang from behind him made Naruto turn and find 2 ANBU between him and his attacker. A third dropped down next to him and, without saying a word, scooped him up in their arms. They bound away, back across the roofs to the Hokage Tower. Naruto briefly noticed the fighting had spread. Fires burned in more areas of the village and the cries of villagers rose into the night. From there, the memory, or dream rather, grew hazier and hazier. Naruto remembered something of old man Hokage taking him and carrying him through the halls, but there it stopped. Lying on the bed, staring into air above him as he listened to the quiet, he couldn't detect any of the panic or distress that had happened. He had to assume it was a dream, but something was telling him it wasn't. It didn't feel so much like a dream as a memory. Though, he wished with all his heart he'd only imagined the incident. Thinking of the slash he took across his side, Naruto slowly lifted the hospital shirt he was wearing. He refused to believe the twinge of pain was anything but his imagination. Yet, when he looked at his side he couldn't deny the bandage wrapped around the precise spot he'd been injured. He rolled over and looked out the window again at the undamaged and whole village less than an hour from waking in the early dawn of a new day. It didn't make sense. He groaned, throwing himself on the bed again and pulling the pillow over his head. What made it worse was the half-thought was still there in his head. Thinking about something else hadn't helped get rid of it at all. Squirming around to a more comfortable position, Naruto resolved to go back to sleep. Maybe when he woke up again all of this would have turned out to be one big dream and he would be back in his own bed in his own apartment. If it didn't turn out to be a dream, he'd march right over to the old man's office and find out what had happened. With that decided he curled up and steadfastly ignored the half-thought still knocking at his brain. XXXXX Minato was still outside Naruto's room, standing at the window in the hallway and watching the dawn spread over the village when Jiraiya came across him half an hour later. He was thankfully calm and collected by then. Though he didn't know how he looked and he felt exhausted, at least he wasn't collapsed on the floor crying like a little genin anymore. "Here you are." Jiraiya's carefree voice boomed down the hallway. "I've been looking everywhere for you, you're usually in your office by now. What happened? You didn't hurt yourself with one of those crazy experiments again, did you?" Minato tried not to wince at the voice. He didn't realize how much of a headache he had until he encountered his sometimes too loud sensei. He ran a hand over his face, pressing 2 fingers into his eyes a moment to counter the burning tiredness that had taken up residence there. "You look awful. Did you get any sleep last night?" Jiraiya asked and Minato could just hear the eye roll mixed in with the concern in the voice. "Not much," he admitted, trying for an apologetic smile, but it came out more as a grimace. "Something came up." "What happened?" Jiraiya asked, the jovial attitude dropping in an instant. "Nothing drastic," Minato said, waving his hands with a nervous chuckle before he rethought the description. well. Nothing dangerous. What I mean is nothing immediately dangerous. You see. He closed his mouth as he realized he was rambling. Even after 10 years of being Hokage, his sensei could still make him feel like an inexperienced academy graduate. Maybe you should just look for yourself, he finally sighed and gestured to the door next to them, still closed and still harboring his son. Jiraiya quirked an eyebrow at him, a thick layer of confusion covering over the concern still hidden beneath the expression. He didn't ask anything more, though, simply went to the door, opened it, and entered the room. Minato turned back to the window, still not ready to face the boy just yet. He had thought he had regained control of himself, but the prospect of re-entering the room made his chest tighten, showing him how brittle that control was. So, instead, he crossed his arms over his chest and tried to prepare for when he did finally go in again. It was only a few moments before Jiraiya re-emerged, pulling the door closed behind him. The frown was more pronounced and his eyes seemed troubled and thoughtful, but that was all. Kid's asleep. Minato, who is that? There was a note of accusation in the question. Minato let out a breath of relief at hearing Naruto was asleep. Maybe he could go in and just sit by the bedside. That wouldn't be as difficult as talking to the boy, facing his eyes. That is Uzumaki Naruto. His sensei's shoulders stiffened and his face grew a little harder. That's not funny. I'm not joking, Minato said in an equally level voice. It was only just occurring to him the many problems he might have explaining to everyone that the child and there was his own son, Naruto. Naruto's dead. He died before he was born. The older man drew in a breath, the concern even heavier in his eyes. I know you miss them, Kushina and Naruto, but wishing some strange boy was your son isn't going to bring him back. You're telling me you didn't notice the resemblance? Minato asked, eyebrows rising. He turned away from the window as sunlight slowly washed across the village, bringing morning to the waking town. Jiraiya shifted where he stood, glancing back to the closed door. Well, yes. But blonde hair and some facial resemblances don't necessarily mean anything. No, but I also know where he came from, and that, more than anything, proves it's not only possible but more than likely. He's what my son would be if he had survived. Minato ran another hand over his face, grimacing at the equal parts confusion and concern warring with each other in the man before him. I'm not explaining this well. I keep forgetting you don't know. His hand went to scratch the back of his head. No, you're not, Jiraiya agreed, the first hint of amusement resurfacing in his tone, though the underlayer was still serious. If you'd bother getting more sleep you'd be able to think straighter. What don't I know? I can't explain it all here. We'll talk after he wakes up again in a secured location, and I'll tell you everything. Until then, just trust me on this, that boy is my son. Sort of. Jiraiya didn't look convinced and the worry was still present in his eyes, winning the battle over confusion and trailed by something Minato refused to accept as pity. Minato turned to the door and entered the room again. A few steps brought him to the chair and he dropped into it with the air of an immovable rock. Behind him he could hear his sensei hovering at the doorway and feel the older man's eyes on his back. He really should head to his office. People would start to question where he was as they trickled into work at the tower. He had paperwork to take care of, mission reports to hear, but he didn't care. The brief conversation with Jiraiya, speaking those words out loud, had allowed a fraction of the truth to sink in past the painful memories. With each moment that passed the initial shock died away and Minato began to grasp what he was being given. It was a second chance. The next time Naruto woke up he was surprised to find the same blonde man from before still sitting by his bed. Though this time, instead of sleeping in a very uncomfortable-looking position, the man was bent over a portable wooden table, grumbling under his breath, a stack of papers at his elbow. Only hours ago this stranger ran from the room just upon hearing Naruto's name. Naruto was so shocked to see him back, sitting calmly at his bedside, that for a while all he could do was lie in his bed and stare. You know, I like the idea of you moving your office here, another voice said, loud and buoyant. It was followed by a large man with long white hair and red facial paint that ran from his eyes down either cheek entering the room, gaze still directed down the hallway. Naruto shifted his eyes, keeping track of the stranger and remaining perfectly still. The nurses here are way better looking than that old battle axe. Of a secretary you have. Chaya-kosen is very good at her job, the blonde man replied distractedly, flipping repeatedly between several different papers, pen held in his mouth and a frown of concentration on his face. Plus, she doesn't try to court me every chance she gets, he added under his breath, causing the other man to let out a booming laugh. The blonde man glanced up just then, looking toward Naruto, then back to his papers before snapping back to Naruto again, pen falling from his mouth. Naruto-kun. You're awake. Yeah. Naruto replied, pushing himself up with a smile and keeping one eye on the blonde man at all times. The last time the man had been so upset and now he looked almost cheerful, except for the brief glare that he sent toward his paperwork. Naruto didn't understand the change in attitude and wasn't sure he trusted it or the man sitting by him. The man hesitated a moment, smile faltering for the briefest of seconds. So how are you feeling? I feel fine. Is old man Hokage back? Naruto asked, hoping that he was. Though, if that was true then the old man probably would be there already. A snort, half-choking sound drew Naruto's attention to the white-haired man in the room. Who do you think you're talking to, kid? The big man asked with a smirk on his face. Naruto tilted his head, a small frown pulling at his lips. I don't know, he didn't tell me his name. Namake's Minato, the blonde man spoke quickly, cutting off any possible reply from the bigger man but gesturing toward said man, and this is Jiraiya Sensei. The Sandaime. I'll explain that later. When? Naruto asked, shifting his gaze between the two. When you get discharged from the hospital, Minato said, glancing sharply to the other man, Jiraiya, who just folded his arms over his chest. Naruto frowned as he watched the two. He felt like something was going on that he wasn't quite getting, not an uncommon occurrence but still unpleasant. Generally, he could sense hostility with no problem, he had too much experience with the villagers not to do so, but the more subtle social tensions often went over his head. Besides, the itch in the back of his head had started again, that half-thought that kept knocking somewhere in his conscious. Mentioning the Sandaime had brought it to the fore again, though he got the feeling it had never really left. It was distracting at best and frustrating at worst. He cast around to find something to distract him from nagging, half-remembered thought. When can I leave? Naruto asked, focusing on getting out of the hospital. He didn't like hospitals in the first place and avoided them at all costs. The nurses were never very nice to him and he was usually left till last for any sort of treatment. Most of the time, it wasn't an issue. He healed quickly enough that the hospital wasn't necessary, or the visit was very short, and the Sandaime always came to get him. Now, however, the Sandaime wasn't here and the hospital gave him far too much time to dwell on the half-thought. Minato's lips quirked a little. Well, since you're feeling better I don't see why you can't leave now. He stood up, knocking a few papers to the floor before leaving the room. Naruto smiled at the retreating back, dismissing the suspicion in favor of enjoying one of the few people he'd met who didn't constantly scowl at him. At first, he hadn't been sure whether Minato liked him. The man had reacted so strangely the other night, but now he was acting nice and it was the second time he'd sat and waited for Naruto to wake. The boy smiled to himself, looking down at the covers, the nagging half-thought forgotten for the moment. The only one who had ever done anything remotely like that was the old man. So what's your name, kid? The other man, Jiraiya, asked while leaning against the wall, arms crossed over his broad chest. Uzumaki Naruto, Naruto replied, puffing out his chest as he crossed his own arms. He eyed the older man with a hint of a challenge in his eye, daring the man to make something of it. Surprisingly, though, Jiraiya had no obvious reaction apart from a little stiffening of the shoulders. Naruto hoped it was because of his reputation as a prankster and not that mysterious other thing that everyone seemed to hate about him. Uzumaki Naruto, huh? The man repeated, half to himself, that's an unusual name. Where'd you get it? Naruto froze. He had never really thought about his name before, besides the obvious connection with ramen. I guess that my parents must have given it to me, he said, voice dropping off at the end. He didn't think about his parents when he could help it. The daily loneliness was painful enough without dwelling on it more than necessary. Where are your parents? Naruto looked down at his hands, done with the conversation. I don't have any now. Jiraiya didn't say anything for a moment and Naruto could feel his eyes on him but refused to return the gaze. Well, that's too bad, kid, the man said after another moment, his voice a little softer. You seem to be doing well, though. Naruto let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He could play this game. Oh yeah, he said, looking up with a big smile on his face, I'm fine, got my own place and everything. Besides, old man Hokage checks in on me when he can. When was the last time the Sandaime checked in on you? Jiraiya asked, a hint of something unidentifiable in his voice. Naruto didn't dwell on it. The half-thought was back again and stronger than ever. He frowned, scrunching his nose as he forced himself to focus on the question, tilting his head to the ceiling in thought. Well, that I thought I saw him last night in the Hokage Tower. I was sure it must have been a dream, but it seemed so real. He shook his head to clear it a little. Before that, a week ago. Jiraiya didn't have time to answer. The door opened and Minato came in followed by a nurse. Naruto looked up and watched as they came closer. Minato smiled at him and he beamed back. It wasn't often he got smiles, so he always made sure to return the few he did get. To his surprise, the nurse smiled as well, making his grin split wider. Well, you seem to be in better shape, the nurse said, smile never leaving her face. Naruto was sure that she must have been new. I'll just do a quick check and if everything is alright, you can go. Excited at the idea of leaving and encouraged by the continued kind tone from the nurse, Naruto scrambled out from under his blankets and to the edge of the bed. The nurse stepped closer and placed a glowing hand near his side where he had been injured. Her brow furrowed a little, making Naruto shift uncomfortably, but at his movement she smoothed her expression. You're much more healed than I would have expected, she said, straightening up a moment later, a little anemic, perhaps. You should definitely eat better, but there's no reason for you to stay here any longer. Naruto only beamed again, more than ready to leave. I'll go get the paperwork for his release. The nurse turned and left the room with a parting smile for Minato. Naruto shouted with happiness, jumping off the bed. He spun around, looking for his shoes when he realized he was still wearing hospital pajamas. Where's my clothes? He looked back to Minato, who had turned to gather his own papers and scrolls from the floor. Oh, Minato paused, realization lighting his eyes, those were too far gone to save. We'll get you a change of clothes on the way to the Hokage Tower. He glanced to Jiraiya, who was watching the interaction with a carefully blank face, eyes lingering on Naruto a little too long for comfort. Too far gone? Naruto repeated, hand going to his side a moment and feeling the bandage under the thin cotton shirt. He still didn't want to believe the attack could have been real. But it had to have been a dream, he said to himself, looking toward the window and the untouched village behind it. What was that? Jiraiya asked, leaning forward a little and drawing Minato's attention from reorganizing his papers. Naruto shook his head, dismissing the matter. Just a dream I had last night, he repeated out loud, as determined to deny the dream memory as he was with the half-thought. You can tell us all about your dream when we get back to the office, Minato cut in as he turned back to his papers, stuffing a much too large stack into a brown folder. In fact, I insist on it. Naruto just shrugged, looking for his sandals again. He didn't care whether he told anyone about his dream. He really didn't. It wasn't as though the attack had happened, so it didn't matter if he talked about it. He repeated that thought over and over in his head as he pulled up the overhang of sheets to peer under the bed. There, just past the edge, were his ninja sandals. He pulled them out and tugged them on, determinedly ignoring the rusty brown stains splashed across parts of his footwear. When he was done, Naruto looked up just in time to see Minato pushing one thick, brown folder into Jiraiya's hands before picking up the other himself. "Ready, Naruto-kun?" Minato asked, a slight stutter at the name. Ignoring the hesitance and focusing instead on the smile, Naruto headed out the door, followed closely by Minato and then Jiraiya. They made their way down to the front desk, intercepting the nurse before she could bring the paperwork up to the room. Minato signed the release forms and started pushing the other two out the main doors before anyone in the lobby could start up a conversation. They walked through the village streets, Minato leading the way, Naruto close by his side, and Jiraiya trailing behind, grumbling under his breath about carrying Minato's paperwork. Naruto couldn't help scanning the areas they passed as he looked for evidence of last night's battle, but the buildings were fine, whole and undamaged. The villagers milled about their business, unaware of the violence that racked their homes the night before. Naruto frowned as he tried to reconcile the scene he remembered from the previous night with the calm morning streets around him. He was so focused on his thoughts that Naruto didn't notice Minato stopping directly in front of him at a street stand. As a result, he walked right into the man's legs, and would have fallen to the ground save for Minato's hand shooting out to stop his fall. "Careful," Minato admonished, but there was no rebuke in the words. "You don't want to fall and hurt yourself right after leaving the hospital." Naruto only blinked at him, unsure of how to respond. Instead he looked at what they'd stopped for, eyeing the streetside stand filled with generic clothes, cheap jewelry, and sandals. The stall owner smiled down at him, which made Naruto blink again. This was strange. "We're only going to get something for you to wear temporarily, until we have the time to get some more clothes for you," Mintao said, leafing through the folded shirts. "Anything's better than those hospital pajamas, right?" He held up a plain black t-shirt, checking its size before turning his attention to the pants. Naruto could only nod dumbly as he watched the man pull out a pair of cargo shorts and hold them up to him as well. He brought a hand up to his head, wondering if he'd hit it before waking up in the hospital. Looking around, Naruto noticed with a start that everyone was acting strangely. No one was glaring at him. A few people stared, confused eyes sliding between Naruto and Minato as the blonde man paid for the clothes, but the looks didn't contain the animosity that he was accustomed to receiving every time he left his door. Jiraiya, standing next to them, wore a slight frown as he eyed first Naruto then Minato, but Naruto couldn't tell if the frown was directed specifically toward him or toward the other man for making Jiraiya carry the heavy folder. Minato dropped a few coins into the stall owner's hand with a soft clink, and then passed the clothes to Naruto. Naruto barely had time to gape at the shirt and shorts before Minato was moving through the streets. Jiraiya gave him a gentle push and he hurried to catch up with the blonde man. They wove their way through increasingly crowded streets. Minato moved quickly, dodging through the crowd with experience, though not so fast as to lose Naruto or Jiraiya. Still, Naruto was thankful that he had so much practice running through crowded streets as he strove to keep up with the man. Around them people called out greetings and waved to Minato, who replied back with his own quick welcome, but passed them before they could say anything more. Soon, they were at the Hokage Tower. Despite knowing that the Sandaime wasn't there, Naruto still hoped that he would find the old man sitting behind his desk buried in paperwork when they got to the office. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something strange was happening. Some of the strange things were nice. He certainly didn't mind when Minato smiled at him or the lack of open anger and dislike from the people in the streets, but he couldn't understand why it had all suddenly changed. The dream or memory or whatever it was hung heavy on his mind, as well. It made his stomach flutter for some reason he couldn't quite identify, and all the while that annoying half-thought lingered at the edge of his conscience. They climbed the stairs to the Hokage's floor and Naruto found he couldn't stop himself. He ran down the hall to the office door, skidding to a stop in front of it. Banging a quick knock, he grabbed the handle and tried to yank open the door. It wouldn't budge no matter how much of his slight body weight he threw into it. "That isn't going to work," Minato called, coming up behind him. "Here, let me get the door." Naruto watched as the man tucked his folder under his arm and ran through some hand signs. They flashed by so fast Naruto couldn't keep track of them, not that he was very good at hand seals yet anyway. A seal flared on the wood in front of them, faded, and then Minato turned the knob opening the door with ease. He shifted the thick folder to one hand and glanced to Naruto. "There's a bathroom a few doors down if you want to change into those clothes right now. You don't have to if you don't want to, of course. Just that in case you do." Naruto didn't say anything right away. He knew where the bathroom was. He'd hidden there once while avoiding Anbu after setting a trap for unsuspecting civilians in the marketplace. Instead, he poked his head past Minato and snuck a quick look at the desk on the other end of the room. It was empty. Pulling back quickly, Naruto could feel his heart sink. They had said the Hokage was gone for some reason, but he still couldn't help but hope that they'd been lying to him. It had happened before, after all. From the empty desk though, it looked like Minato was telling the truth and, as novel as that was, he would rather have had the lie. It would have been something familiar amongst the growing number of subtle changes that he had noticed. Hoping to mask his disappointment at not finding the old man, Naruto nodded his head quickly before hurrying down the hall to the bathroom. He locked the door behind him and hugged the new set of clothes to his chest, unable to understand the sudden nervousness that gripped him. The clothes didn't offer any comfort, instead they only made things worse. They smelled strange, not like the market usually smelled. It wasn't a very noticeable difference, but something very subtle that he probably wouldn't have caught if not for all the other strangeness that had put him on edge. He slid down the door till he was sitting on the ground, knees pulled tight to his chest, crushing the shirt and shorts between the two, trying and failing to understand it all. XXXXX Jiraiya eyed the boy as he scurried to the bathroom, disappearing behind the door. There was the faint click of a lock and Jiraiya turned, following Minato into the office. He dropped the heavy folder of forms and reports onto one of the chairs sitting along the wall and watched the blond man with a careful eye. His former student was busy clearing his desk of paperwork that had accumulated that morning, stacking it off to the side, on the floor, on the side table, wherever he could find room. Normally, Minato would get right to work on the piles and have them significantly reduced if not completed by lunchtime. Then, he would move on to some other project or duty with barely a chance to stop and eat. Minato's workaholic tendencies had always worried Jiraiya, especially in those first few years after Kushina's and Naruto's death. The man buried himself in activity to avoid dwelling on the tragedy, and the relentless pace only got worse as the years went by. For a short time, Jiraiya had tried to distract his former student by finding other, healthier outlets to work through his grief or at least keep his mind busy. Most had failed, though to be honest, most had been various women thrown in Minato's path hoping he'd find a second true love. Jiraiya wasn't too surprised when none had worked out and gave up eventually. In the end, he settled with encouraging Minato to engage hobbies that would at least prove useful or fun rather than drowning in endless hours of office work. Jiraiya still hated seeing the person that he viewed almost as a son skate so close to the edge of exhaustion and burnout while Jiraiya himself couldn't to lift a finger to stop it. Despite the obvious sleep deprivation of the night before, the man now before him was still the same energetic Hokage that Jiraiya had come to know in the past 8 years, but there was something different. The energy was not quite so manic as it always seemed to be, it seemed more excited and happy, if a little nervous as Minato swept over his workspace, shoving piles of work, scrolls, and books out of the way. It would have made Jiraiya happy, himself, to see some life coming back into Minato except for the source of the change. His eyes flicked to where he knew the bathroom to be and he frowned. If the boy turned out to be anything other than Minato's sort of son, he feared that would be the final crack needed to destroy the younger man. Jiraiya was not going to allow that to happen, and if he had to protect Minato from a mere boy he would do so by any means necessary. Turning around, Jiraiya moved back to the door and glanced out into the hallway. The bathroom was still closed and there was no sign of the boy anywhere else. Anbu littered the building, so worrying about the child wandering off was not a major concern. He turned back into the room and closed the door behind him. "Minato," Jiraiya said, voice completely serious, "are you sure that you're thinking this through?" "Yes, of course," Minato said with a dismissive wave of the hand as he gathered up coffee mugs from around his desk to take back to the office kitchen. The Hokage counted them softly, a surprised look on his face at the large number of stolen cups. Jiraiya let out a sigh before he raised his voice just the slightest bit. "Minato. Stop." The tone, usually used for flustered genin and chunin, brought Minato to a halt. He looked at Jiraiya with surprise before recognizing the set face and slightly narrowed eyes. "All right," he said. He placed the mugs down on a side table, straightening his shoulders a little and settling himself into his desk chair. "What's bothering you?" Looking at the younger man, Jiraiya had to restrain himself from rolling his eyes. The clasped hands and overly straight posture hardly encouraged an easy discussion, but he plowed on anyway, determined to voice his concerns. "I'm worried you're investing too much into this boy without knowing anything about him. What proof do you have that he's your son? So he has a name, anyone could have gotten hold of that name. Even his looks could be manufactured or arranged. Orochimaru himself was experimenting with cloning and genetic manipulation before he was discovered and thrown out of the village. How do you know this isn't some trick or ploy to get to you? You have enough enemies out there with enough power to try something like this. How do you know?" Minato stiffened with every word, face going carefully blank as his knuckles slowly turned white from their tightening grip. Jiraiya saw all the warning signs of oncoming tension and anger but didn't stop. He needed to get this off his chest, hurt feelings be damned. "I don't want you to get hurt and relive the same loss you faced 8 years ago," the older man continued in a softer tone. "Even if the boy is completely innocent of any ill intention, he's clearly addled. He told me he saw the Sandaime only a week ago, that Sarutobi looks after him sometimes." When Jiraiya wound down, Minato took a deep breath and waited a moment before asking in a quiet voice, "Are you finished?" Only silence greeted the question. Jiraiya had nothing more to say before seeing Minato's reaction. "I don't appreciate the concern," Minato said after another moment, shoulders slowly relaxing as he absorbed Jiraiya's objections, "and I can see how, from your position, those would be valid considerations. But you don't have all the facts yet." "You said that before," Jiraiya said, encouraged by Minato's understanding tone. "What are you not telling me?" The younger man huffed quietly, running a hand over his face before he slouched down in his chair. "We really should wait for Naruto to get back. He may have some information, although I'm not sure how much of it will be useful after our talk last night. Still, he deserves to hear about where he is as much as anyone." "Does this have anything to do with the dream he had last night?" Jiraiya asked with a sigh. He wouldn't be getting anything out of Minato until the kid came back. "Did he tell you about his dream?" Minato asked, perking up at the reminder. "No," Jiraiya said, slouching against the wall and making himself comfortable, but he got a strange look in his eye when he brought it up. Minato nodded, his eyes falling from Jiraiya to the cleared desktop in front of him, a slight frown forming on his face. "If there's anything we will need to worry about, I have a feeling it will be that dream." Jiraiya's own eyes narrowed at that, liking the sound of those words less than he did the thought of a strange boy suddenly appearing and claiming to be the Hokage's son. "You don't think it was a dream?" Minato looked back up to him and Jiraiya could see the complete conviction in the depths of his blue eyes. "No, I don't." XXXXX Payne stared at the blank wall, face as impassive as always despite his racing thoughts. He remained that way, puzzling over the wall, even when one of his shinobi dropped down behind him, landing on one knee, head bent in deference. Silence stretched out as the shinobi waited to be recognized, and Payne was fine with making him wait. He was still pondering the wall. "Report," he said finally, voice low and emotionless. "Sir," the shinobi said, still in his bent position on one knee, "we have control of 60% of the city as well as the front gate. We have, however, sustained heavy casualties along with the IWA forces, though reports of the Konoha shinobi's forces indicate the same. There is some concern over the lack of proof of death for the majority of high-ranking Konoha shinobi. There is also no indication of the location of Uzumaki Naruto." Payne listened to the report with half an ear. Most he knew or could guess already. He let the silence stretch out a little longer, indifferent to the tension he could feel from the man at his feet. "Send for our seal breakers, have them report here. Make sure the IWA forces do not hear of this," he said, breaking the stillness that had fallen in the dark hallway. The shinobi nodded with a respectful, "Hi, Payne-sama," and disappeared as quickly as he came. Payne waited until he was well away from that position before stepping forward and placing a hand on the wall. He knew the Kyubi container had disappeared. His spy inside the tower had reported that the last sighting of the boy had been with the Hokage heading for this area in the depths of the Hokage Tower. After searching the surrounding rooms, their contents, their floor plans, and the distinct chakra signature lingering around that section of wall, he could only conclude there was another door hidden from view. Conan appeared in a flutter of paper beside him, content to wait in silence. "The Hokage brought him here," Payne said without preamble. The woman beside him made no comment on the lack of a door. "It will take the seal breakers some time," Conan said. "We can expect a counter-attack soon and this area will be one of the first targets. The Kyubi is half our purpose for being here, we cannot allow it to escape or remain hidden." The seal-cracking team arrived, slightly breathless, and hurried to kneel. Payne did not bother to look at them, only gesturing to the wall as he turned back toward the exit and upper floors beyond the staircase. "I want that door opened," he said, and was gone, leaving behind the confused faces of his subordinates. Minato took one last deep breath, relieving the tension that had built up during Jiraiya's little speech. Naruto seemed wary enough around them without either of them giving him more of a reason to be nervous. When he thought about it from Jiraiya's position, he could see why his sensei was concerned and he was grateful, but he still hoped Jiraiya would come around once the other world was explained. Minato also wanted to have his sensei's opinion on what might have happened. The elder man ran an international spy ring and had knowledge and experience in areas that Minato had no access. The knob jiggling drew Minato out of his thoughts as the door opened and Naruto entered the room. The clothes fit well enough in length, but seemed a little baggy. The budding father made a note to himself to feed the boy more as well as have Tsunade run a complete checkup. The boy's steps slowed a moment when he looked up and saw Minato sitting behind the Hokage's desk. Minato winced at the shadow that briefly passed over Naruto's face. He should have thought ahead to what the child would think at seeing another sitting behind what Naruto still thought of as the Sandame's desk, but if all went well they could clear everything up soon. Standing up from his seat, Minato nodded toward the door again. "Sensei, would you get that end of the room?" Jiraiya nodded and closed the door before locking it and running through the hand signs to activate the privacy seals. Minato closed the windows and ran through the same signs for the other side of the room. Along the walls symbols flared too. Life before dying again, and an unnatural stillness fell over the room as noise from the outside world was blocked. Satisfied, Minato turned back to the other two. "I wish Kakashi could be here, but he's not due back to the village for a few days and he already knows half of it, so that can wait." He paused a moment as he gathered his thoughts. "Several months ago I started a project to recreate the Sandame seeing crystal. Couldn't make it work, could you?" Jiraiya cut in, a hint of mocking in his voice and a smirk tugging at his lips. "No," Minato admitted in a flat voice with a blank face. He refused to give Jiraiya the chance to gloat or any great amount of satisfaction out of this. "You were right, there, now we can move on. One of the prototypes I developed had an unexpected result. When I activated the chakra crystal, I found myself looking at the Sandaime." The brief flash humor had died from Jiraiya's face, replaced by serious contemplation. "Not the afterlife," he said, more as a statement than question. "No," Minato agreed more soberly as well, noticing the confused look on Naruto's face, and hurried to explain in greater detail. "After talking to him, we both determined it was a window between two separate worlds. What could have happened but didn't?" The older man's eyes went wide before collapsing into a deep frown. "How can you be sure it was the real Sandaime and not some trick?" "I questioned him thoroughly," Minato replied with a nod. "He knew things only the real Sarutobi Hiruzen would know, as well as some of the Sandaime's signature moves, and he did the same to me." "But," Naruto cut in, face scrunched up like Kushina's again. This time, though, the painful stab to Minato's heart wasn't quite as sharp. "What do you mean, how things could have happened?" Minato brought a hand to his chin as he leaned against the desk, thinking for a moment. "Let me explain it this way. Every time you make a choice in life, there are two possible outcomes. Like if you were walking down the road and you came to an intersection. Your day might be different depending on if you went left or right. Well, for each decision you make, another version of reality is created somewhere else where another version of you made the opposite choice. Of course, there's an opposing theory that says given the same situation with the same variables and same knowledge, a person would make the same choice." Jiraiya cut in with a casual wave of his hand. Naruto's face, which had started to clear up from its confusion, only scrunched up again, looking back and forth between the two men. Minato shot his sensei a glare that sent the older man back a step, hands coming up in a placating gesture. Letting out an exasperated sigh, Minato guided Naruto to one of the chairs facing his desk and knelt down in front of him. "Ignore him. He's just gotten into the bad habit of trying to distract me. The point is that there are many versions of the world out there, like rooms in a house, and I managed to open a window into one of those other rooms. Do you understand?" Minato held his breath a little as he watched his son's face scrunch up in concentration. He glanced up to his sensei and noted with relief that some of the tension had left the older man's shoulders. Even if Naruto didn't fully understand, the important thing right now was getting Jiraiya on his side. Kakashi already knew about the crystal, he was one of the few besides Minato that did, so there was nothing to worry in that quarter. If he could convince Jiraiya, he would also have a good chance with Tsunade. "It seems really complicated," Naruto finally said, a faint frown still on his face. "That's all right, Naruto-kun," Minato replied, silently cheering at managing to say his son's name out loud without stuttering. He placed his hands on the boy's shoulders for a moment before pushing himself up to his feet again, then leaned back against the desk and folded his arms over his chest. "You said you had a dream last night. Could you tell me about it?" Naruto didn't say anything for a moment, eyes focused on his hands in front of him, frown pulling down at the corners of his mouth. "I was in my apartment when something woke me up. There was a battle going on out at the edge of the village. Then, someone broke into my apartment. I tried to get away, but they got my side with a kunai and grabbed me. I was able to get away, kinda, when some shinobi with masks appeared and rescued me. One of them brought me to Hokage Tower. I think old man Sandaime took me down to the lower halls in the tower, but I can't remember anything after that. There was fighting everywhere and all the civilians were heading for the shelters. It seemed so real, but everything's fine in the village now and it doesn't make sense." Naruto looked up to him, eyes wide and confused, and Minato wished he could say something comforting. That was all a dream and Naruto's home world wasn't plunged into war, but he couldn't lie. The boy must have seen it there in Minato's mirroring blue eyes because he blinked and looked off to the window where the village spread out around them, full swing into another normal day. It wasn't a dream, was it? Naruto asked, with resignation. No, it wasn't, Minato said, voice soft as he explained. The attack happened in your version of events. Here, there was never any attack and the Sandaime from this world died years ago during an uprising. The blonde head snapped back to Minato, eyes wide again. The old man's dead, he cried in alarm. Minato winced as he realized he could have broken that news a little more delicately. The Sandaime from this world, he clarified quickly, the one you know is fine. Probably. He trailed off at the end, belatedly realizing that if the other world was in the midst of a war, if Konoha itself was under attack, there was no guarantee that Sarutobi was alright. Looking at the sheer relief on Naruto's face, though, Minato found he didn't have the heart to explain that to the boy. He grimaced to himself at the thought of something happening in that other place. It was clear the boy cared deeply for the old man. Naruto kept asking about him and the disappointment at not finding the Sandaime in the office had been written over the boy's face. Do you remember anything else? Minato asked, eager to steer the conversation away from Sarutobi's death. Naruto crossed his arms and tilted his head to the ceiling, brow furrowed. He muttered to himself for a moment before he spoke slowly, the one who grabbed me had a weird hitai. It had a bunch of lines on it. Before that, I'd never seen it. Minato frowned in thought. 4 lines? It sounded like Amigakure, but they would never have the resources for an invasion of Konoha. Then again, he was completely unfamiliar with that other world's political situation. He gritted his teeth, suddenly wishing he'd gotten more information on what had bothered the Sandaime so much. As it was, Minato had little to no understanding what was happening in that other place and why. Do you remember anything else? Jiraiya asked, his voice breaking into Minato's thoughts. Naruto shook his head, his shaggy blonde swung back and forth. How should I know what was going on? No one ever tells me anything, he complained in a loud voice. Of course not, Jiraiya said dismissingly, you're just a brat. Wait till you get older. Naruto scowled, shoulders hunching as he looked at the older man. Jiraiya ignored the glowering 8-year-old, taking a few steps closer to Minato's desk. Do you remember anything from your conversations? The last few weeks he was stressed about something, you could see it, and he was increasingly busy, too busy to talk. He wouldn't tell me what was wrong, though, Minato replied as he ran through his last several conversations with the older Hokage in his mind. Has anything else come through? Jiraiya's eyes flicked to Naruto before returning to Minato. Minato had no difficulty deciphering what his sensei was implying. If one 8-year-old boy could come through, what else could? They had to consider the possibility of hostiles making their way from the other world. Not yet. I'm not even sure how Naruto-kun came here since we only discussed the possibility in theory a few times. The Sandaime must have devised a way to send living things and objects through without my knowledge. Where are you keeping it? I'd like to see. Jiraiya turned toward the door. Minato pushed up to his feet and followed, gesturing for Naruto to come along. It's down in the lower level. Seeing it might jog more of Naruto-kun's memory. Naruto hopped off the chair, running to catch up with the 2 adults. He looked at Minato with a soft frown as he came up to the 2 men. But, he said uncertainly. Minato let Jiraiya run through the hand signs to unseal the door. He looked down to his son with an encouraging smile. What is it? Naruto-kun? His smile widened, he was getting better at saying that name. If old man Sandaime isn't the Hokage, then who is? Now, Minato smiled in embarrassment, though there was some pride behind the expression. Somehow telling his son he was the Hokage made the position seem new and exciting again. Me. Minato-kun is the Yondaime Hokage, Jiraiya said as he opened the door. Minato followed his sensei to the hall, turning back when he didn't hear Naruto's footsteps close behind them. Naruto was staring at him with wide eyes and slightly gaping mouth. The yondaime? Naruto repeated, sounding more like a question. He crossed his arms and bent his head, intense concentration filling his expression. But he died. Killing the demon fox. Did that happen differently, too? Yes, Minato said, not having the heart to explain more than that at the moment. He was relieved. Naruto seemed to be grasping the idea, but disappointed by the reaction at the same time. Then, looking into his son's eyes as they slowly filled with admiration but still no recognition, it dawned on him. Naruto didn't know who his parents were. The realization took some of the excitement out of Minato. His son didn't know him, only recognized him as some dead, distant hero from the village. The thought was depressing, and Minato reminded himself that he would ask the Sandaime about it the next time they spoke. He opened his mouth ready to tell Naruto then and there who he was, but Minato stopped himself. Naruto already had enough dropped on him that day. The boy was still grappling with the idea of different realities and an invasion in his home world. It wouldn't be fair to put more on the 8-year-old. Minato silently promised he would tell Naruto, and soon, just not now. Smiling faintly, Minato turned back to the open door. Jiraiya was there, blocking the way and watching the two of them. Minato was grateful to see more understanding than suspicion in his sensei's eyes. It was better than the pity he'd seen at the hospital. Nodding once, Jiraiya moved aside and the older blonde swept past and led to the staircase. They descended down to the first floor and moved to a separate staircase heading to the lower, more secure levels. The deeper they went, the fewer people they saw until it was just the three of them, footsteps echoing through the long halls. The lighting was dimmer in this section of the tower and there were more doors spread around the corridors, each with seals to prevent unauthorized personnel from entering sensitive areas. Next to him, Minato could feel Naruto draw closer as they walked through the silent halls. He glanced down to see the smaller blonde head swiveling around with wide eyes. A part of him wanted to reach out and reassure the boy, even just a pat on the head, but he didn't know how Naruto would react. Minato would be lying to himself if he said he knew what he was doing as well. He got along very well with children in general, but knowing Naruto was his son made things different, complicated. Instead, he just smiled down to the boy next to him. "Don't worry, Naruto-kun, there's nothing here that will harm you." "I'm not scared," Naruto insisted in a loud voice, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked away with an indignant pout, though Minato thought the effect was somewhat ruined on the small whiskered face. "Of course not," the dry voice of Jiraiya came up from immediately behind them. Naruto didn't get a chance to reply, though he had turned and opened his mouth to do just that. Minato stopped at the door leading to the crystal mirror, the last room in the corridor. "We're here." Naruto's head snapped back to their destination, eyes going wide again. Minato gently pushed his son off to the side and behind, giving himself room to open the door. He ran through the hand signs to unseal the room and release the entrance. It took longer than opening his office due to the sheer number and complexity of the seals put in place, especially with the extra measures he'd set up after finding Naruto. Jiraiya stepped up behind him and next to Naruto as the two watched Minato work. At one point, Naruto started to say something, a questioning tone in his voice, but Jiraiya shushed him quickly and Minato maintained his focus on the door. When he was finished, he stepped back, letting out a deep sigh. Jiraiya strode past him, nodding approval at the long list of security seals on the door and surrounding walls. The room was exactly as Minato had left it. The mirror stood in the center, blank and relatively ordinary. The lights clicked on as they entered, throwing the shadows at odd angles. Minato's eyes caught the spot of dried blood on the floor from where he had found Naruto. His stomach gave a little lurch at thinking of his son's blood on the floor. He would have to have it cleaned as soon as possible. The darkened spot also drew the Sanin's attention and Jiraiya crouched down at the spot, examining it with a frown. "That's from when I found Naruto-kun," Minato said in a low voice, moving a little closer, but still staying away from the remnant. Jiraiya grunted and stood back up before turning to the mirror. So this is what you used to contact the Sandaime. It was a statement rather than a question. Yes, Minato answered, though there was no need, there was nothing else in the room with which to contact anyone. We've been conversing for several months now. I am convinced he is a very similar if not the same man as he was here. He would not put us in jeopardy intentionally. No, I agree with you there, Jiraiya said as he circled the mirror, eyes alight with interest. My concern is the others in his world. How did he send Naruto through, when you confess you don't even know how to do that? Minato crossed his arms, nodding his agreement. I intend to ask him the next time we speak. Actually, there are several things I'm going to ask him. Is it wise to open it again, knowing that others can come through? Jiraiya asked as he looked back at Minato. We should know what is going on and try to find out more about Naruto-kun. We'll never know unless we get back in touch with them. Then, there is also that the mirror was closed on my end when Naruto came through. Plus, what if the threat they're facing also exists in this world? I would rather have a warning than be blindsided by an unknown enemy. Jiraiya grunted his agreement, then shook his head in mock exasperation. You always get yourself in these types of situations. For being a genius, you sure seem to have a hard time taking it easy. Minato rolled his eyes, says the man who practically challenged me to the project that led to this in the first place. I plan on placing an ANBU guard or two on this now that we know things can come through. It would be helpful if we could get any information on what happened in that world. Maybe the brat has remembered something after seeing this thing. Naruto-kun, Minato said, noticing just how quiet the boy was. He turned and looked back to the door and frowned. Naruto was standing a few paces into the room. He was staring at the crystal mirror completely still, an intense look of concentration on his face. Naruto-kun? Minato asked again, moving closer. He didn't receive a response. Naruto didn't even seem to hear him. Naruto? Are you alright? There was an edge of panic in his voice as he knelt down next to the boy. Jiraiya hurried next to them. What's wrong? He asked as he looked over Naruto. He's not responding, Minato said unnecessarily. He turned Naruto by the shoulders toward him, but his son's gaze lay fixed on the crystal glass. Grasping the small chin, he gently turned Naruto's head to face him, but even then the eyes remained fixed on the device. Minato felt a hand squeeze his heart as every attempt to reach the boy failed. Minato glanced back to the crystal. It stood dark and silent, reflecting back their own room in their own world instead of the other one where the Sandaime still lived. He didn't know why it was having such an effect on his son. Without being activated it was little more than a chakra crystal, but they could work that out after he got Naruto away from the mirror. Picking Naruto up, Minato swept himself and his son out the door. XXXXX Naruto had a strong sense of déjà vu as he watched Minato run through hand signs, revealing multiple seals spread over the door and surrounding wall. The sensation wasn't from earlier at the office door either, it was something deeper than that and equally elusive. He shook his head clear and eagerly peered into the dimmed room. Curiosity piqued despite the creepiness of the setting. Minato and Jiraiya entered ahead of him, crouching down around something on the floor and talking in lowered voices. Naruto's gaze followed the Yondaime for a moment, still not believing he was with his hero, the famous Hokage that saved their village from destruction. Half of him expected to wake up, the same doubt about reality turning into a dream resurfacing, but it was the truth. He knew it. Naruto looked over to the one object in the room besides the few lights lining the walls. It was a large, flat glass of some kind, maybe crystal, standing almost as tall as Minato. It reflected a muted image of the room back to them, their three figures shining vaguely on its glossy surface. The moment he laid his eyes on it, Naruto found he couldn't look away. The rest of the room faded to the background until it almost didn't exist and it was just him and the crystal mirror staring at one another. He was waiting, he realized suddenly. Naruto didn't know why, or for what, but something was supposed to happen and he had to wait for it. He'd stand there staring at the crystal all day if he had to, but he'd wait. It was important, vital even, though he couldn't begin to explain it. For a moment, he thought he remembered something else, words being spoken to him. It was too blurry, though, too far out of reach to grasp fully, but aggravatingly important to remember. Naruto. The sound of the voice calling his name made Naruto jerk, shaken at the sudden and loud volume. He looked up wildly, wondering what he could have possibly done to get in trouble when he'd just been standing there and looking. With a start, Naruto realized they were out of the chamber and back in the hall. Minato was kneeling in front of him, the wide blue eyes staring into his with alarm. Naruto? Minato said again, this time as a question. Naruto blinked at him, still confused. What? He asked, faintly defensive. I didn't do anything. Minato let out a relieved sigh, his shoulders sagging as he held his grip on Naruto's arms. Naruto frowned at the man. The Hokage wasn't hurting him, but he still wasn't entirely comfortable with the contact. Then, he found himself being pulled into a hug. Naruto froze, stiffening in the arms wrapped around him. He turned wide, bewildered eyes up to Jiraiya, who was standing by the closed door. You weren't responding, the older man said. He turned to the door as started running through hand signs resealing the room. You scared me half to death, Minato mumbled half to himself, then pulled back suddenly, looking directly at Naruto. What happened? Naruto squirmed slightly under the gaze. He was used to staring, but it seemed different when this Hokage did it. I don't know, he said, shaking his head. I just looked at that thing and I don't know. Minato let out another sigh, squeezing Naruto's arms once more before standing up. That's enough surprises for one day, I think. I'll show you where you'll be staying. Where will I be staying? Naruto asked, curiosity piqued, though he was still unnerved by what had happened. With me, Minato replied, steering Naruto back down the corridor. Minato, Jiraiya spoke up from behind them, but he was cut off by the Hokage. He's staying with me. His tone was final, ending any and all discussion about the topic. Naruto blinked up in surprise at the blonde just behind him. He didn't know what to think about the entire situation. It was just too confusing. The only thing he was certain of was the relief at the prospect of getting a break from it all. More than anything, though, he wanted to get out of the lower corridors of the Hokage Tower. He didn't know what type of house the Hokage lived in, but any place was better than the dark, echoing hallways, especially that room with the crystal. Here we are. Minato tried to inject as much enthusiasm into his voice as possible. Since leaving the Hokage Tower, particularly the room housing the crystal glass, Naruto had been quiet. Minato didn't know if this was normal for the boy. He knew surprisingly little about Naruto, but that didn't stop him from trying to cheer up the general mood. Arriving at the house seemed to distract them both. Minato smiled as Naruto's head swiveled to and fro, taking in as much of the house as he could. Customarily used by the Hokage, the building was located in a quieter section of the village, away from the busy center but still within the walls. It wasn't the grandest house in the village. It was old, and since its creation other, larger houses had gone up, but it still held a calm dignity. A small garden and lawn surrounded it on either side, though the grounds looked a little overgrown. The house had 2 stories, the traditional style beautiful in its simplicity. In all honesty, the house was too big for Minato, and he sometimes hated returning to it at night. He only used a few rooms inside and spent as much time away from it as possible. Occasionally, he would think of moving into a smaller apartment. There was no rule or law saying the Hokage must live there, but Kushina had loved the house. She had once said that it reminded her of the houses in Whirlpool before her country was destroyed, so Minato stayed. Fumbling with the folders that had been thrust onto him by a frantic clerk before leaving the tower, Minato unlocked the door. He nudged his son inside and turned, looking for his sensei. The toad sage had surreptitiously disappeared soon after leaving the tower. Part of Minato was glad to have a moment alone with Naruto without Jiraiya's cautious eye surveying every interaction between the two, or move from the boy, but another part of him wondered what the old man was up to. Minato didn't want to have to spend another afternoon smoothing over complaints from half the young women in the village. Still, there was no sign of Jiraiya outside, so Minato kicked the door closed with one foot and dropped his heavy stack of paperwork on the nearest flat surface before pulling off his sandals. He glared at the stack, quietly cursing his own inability to escape without the clerk's notice. The desk ninja's demeanor had quickly gone from shock to panic at finding out that the Hokage was leaving unexpectedly for an undetermined amount of hours without finishing the morning's reports. One last glance at the loathed pile and Minato was fairly certain that the reports weren't more likely to be finished at the house with Naruto around than if they had both stayed in his empty office. Minato smiled at Naruto as the boy gazed around the inside of the house as much as the outside. The entrance hall was one of the few places Minato still put effort into maintaining well. The furniture was simple and elegant dark wood, much of it predating Minato's time in the house. On the rare occasions that visitors came to the house, they mostly kept to the entrance hall or the sitting room beyond the first main door. Naruto wandered around the edge of the hall, closely examining everything and anything in reach, pulling open drawers and peering into the closet. He came to the sitting room entrance and poked his head in, Minato following behind him and doing the same. The older blonde cringed as he saw the state of the room. It was relatively clean, free of dust and clutter, with two couches placed facing each other in the center of the room around a low coffee table. The few extra chairs and side tables around the walls were straight, as was the large bookshelf lining the far wall. The only things out of place were the books strewn all around the room, stacked on the coffee table, side tables, and couch cushions rather than on the shelves reserved for them. "I meant to pick those up," Minato muttered to himself, pulling Naruto away from the sitting room. "Well," he said in a louder voice as he guided the boy toward the stairs, "I guess we should find you a room to stay in first." Naruto looked up at him, surprise and excitement in his expression. "So I really get to stay here?" he asked, eyes wide and bright. "And you don't mind?" "Of course I don't mind," Minato said, half distracted as he thought of bedrooms that would be usable. He came out of his thoughts just long enough to smile down at his son. "I'm glad to have you stay." Minato started leading the way up the stairs but paused when he couldn't hear the sound of steps behind him. He turned back and looked down. Naruto was still at the foot of the stairs, staring at the steps before him with a frown. "Naruto-kun?" Minato asked. "Why are you doing this?" Naruto asked, looking up at him. The confusion and barest trace of suspicion in Naruto's eyes hit Minato like a physical blow, and for the first time he wondered what type of life Naruto had growing up alone in the village. He wouldn't think that his son would be abandoned if things had been different. Still, there were little things, behavioral tics, reactions, and comments like the last one which were making Minato nervous. He had a sinking feeling that he was not going to like what he found out about Naruto's life in the mirror world. It was yet another thing on the growing list of items to discuss with the Sandaime. He pushed it to the side, though. It was a topic for another time, in another place. Right now, his focus was on making Naruto comfortable with a room for the night. Minato backtracked down the stairs and knelt so that he was level with the boy. "I'm doing this because I want to, because you're my son," he added silently. He was tempted to just tell Naruto the truth, but he didn't know where to begin, didn't even know how to continue the conversation if he did manage to start. Instead, he found himself reaching out and grasping Naruto's shoulders. "I know this is probably very confusing, but I promise I'll explain, at least what I understand of it. First, let's find you a place to stay." Naruto stared at Minato for a long moment, and the man had the sudden feeling he was being weighed and measured. The confusion didn't completely leave Naruto's face, but the frown smoothed out and his eyes brightened. Then, Naruto was running up the stairs, pulling away from Minato's hands in a burst of energy. Right. Do I get my own room? Which one is it? He yelled, bare feet pattering on the wooden stairs. Minato blinked in surprise and hurried to catch up. Some of the rooms aren't quite ready to have someone stay in them. He got to the second floor and found Naruto poking his head into the first door on the right. That room is my office, he said, pulling the boy away from the half-open door. He caught a brief glance at the workspace covered with books, scrolls, and half-finished ceiling experiments, what the sitting room could become if neglected for another few weeks. You're not to go in there unless I give you my permission or it's an emergency. There's sensitive material in there, and I don't want you getting hurt, understood? Minato pulled the door closed, trying to sound stern. There were some dangerous scrolls in there and several of the projects he was working on weren't safe for an academy student. He reminded himself to place some security seals on the door just in case. Luckily, the 8-year didn't seem interested in the room in the slightest. Naruto shrugged and hurried on to the next door. Minato followed suit and wrinkled his nose at the state of the neighboring room. Dust lay everywhere in the single bedroom. There were boxes stacked on the floor and the bed frame was bare of its mattress. Minato spotted it leaning up against the corner. It took him a moment to remember that the room had been turned into storage years ago. This one won't do. You can say that again, Naruto mumbled and pulled away from the door and headed the other way down the hall to the left of the staircase. The next room was in a similar state, but lacked the boxes and had a mattress that was at least on the bed. Looking into rooms he hadn't physically visited for years, Minato felt surprisingly embarrassed. I don't use these rooms much, haven't needed to. That's okay. Naruto called, heading to the next door. He seemed more excited by the act of exploring than anything else. I don't like cleaning either. Minato frowned to himself. That wasn't the impression he had wanted to give to his son. He really was a neat person. Besides the habit of leaving his reading everywhere, he had always been the neater of the two when compared to Kushina. Most of the rooms in the house simply weren't needed, considering how little he was there, so he never used them. He added cleaning out the house on his list of things to do. Maybe he would have some genin go through the empty rooms as a D-rank mission. The third room held a greater surprise than the two before it. Managing to open the door before Naruto, Minato stopped at seeing Jiraiya running a hand over a plain bureau, the Sannin's large pack sitting on the bed, curtains rustling on either side of an open window. Minato-kun, you need a maid, the older man said before Minato could speak, preferably a young, pretty, and single one. The bachelor Hokage rolled his eyes at the comment. What are doing, sensei? He pushed the door open wider, letting Naruto into the room. This one didn't seem too bad. The dust was only a thin layer and the bed was already made. He eyed the pack sitting on the same bed. What does it look like? Jiraiya said, brushing the dust off his hands and smiling at both blondes. Here I am in town, needing a place to stay, and I thought what better place than my old student's house. He has more room than he can stand and wouldn't turn away an old friend. No bathhouse this time? Minato asked, a knowing smirk on his face. What? And neglect my favorite student? Jiraiya asked, exaggerated shock in his voice. It's almost like you don't want me to stay. That hurts, I thought you would appreciate the company. Minato rolled his eyes again, but the smile stretched a little wider and there was more relief in it than humor. Minato was starting to feel a little out of his depth. He'd been living alone for so long and suddenly an 8-year-old was in his care. The thought of having help was a relief and it would mean that his sensei would be close at hand to help with any situations. We'd be glad for the company, wouldn't we, Naruto-kun? Naruto looked startled to be included in the statement, wide, surprised eyes shooting up to Minato's smiling face then moving to Jiraiya's before a low smile spread over his own. Yeah. Naruto cried, a little louder than necessary, that'd be great. Now there's 3 of us. We just need to find one more room then, and he was off, shooting out of the room and down the hall. Minato glanced after the streak of blonde hair and saw Naruto open the door to another room that he knew was a closet. The boy's enthusiasm was contagious, like Kushina's had been, and he smiled back to Jiraiya who was shaking his head. That kid better not be that energetic all the time. I'm too old to deal with loud brats, the smile on the man's face as he turned to his pack undermining the complaint. He'll probably run you into the ground if he is old. Man, Minato said, adding after a moment, he'll probably run me into the ground. I wonder where he gets it all. He thought of the seal that he had seen on Naruto's stomach. He had forgotten about it after everything that had happened. Putting a hand into his pocket, Minato pulled out the scroll which he had copied Naruto's seal onto. Here, look at this. Tell me what you think of it in private after we find Naruto a room. His serious tone made Jiraiya look at him and then at the outstretched scroll. He took the scroll, pulling it open and running a quick eye over the contents. This is one of your seals, he said with a furrowed brow. Not quite, it's been modified, Minato said. Down the hall he heard another door closing beyond the closet and hurried out of the room. Look it over carefully and tell me what you think. XXXXX. In the end, they settled for a room next to Minato's. It was covered in just as much dust as the others, but had a full set of furniture and a large window that Naruto loved. Despite his claim that he disliked cleaning, Naruto seemed excited enough about the prospect of his own room in the shared house to attack the dust contaminating it. They would have to get Naruto some more clothes and other essentials, but Minato was satisfied enough with the day's progress to leave that off for another time. He left the boy with a bucket of water and some rags, promising to check on him in an hour or so after talking with Jiraiya. The older man was sitting on the bed in the room he'd claimed his own, looking over the seal. His face was creased in concentration and his bag, still packed, had been shifted to the floor. Minato slipped into the room and shut the door behind him. He crossed to a chair pushed up against the desk next to the window and, turning it to face his sensei, sat down to wait. Several minutes passed in silence before Jiraiya opened his mouth to speak. This is one of your seals, he said without looking up. I remember when you were working on it. I doubt I've caught all the modifications you mentioned, but I've noticed a few. When did you make those? I didn't, Minato replied, leaning back and crossing his arms and legs. I found that seal on Naruto's stomach. That brought Jiraiya's head up, his wide eyes meeting Minato's. This was on Naruto's stomach, he repeated in amazement. Minato didn't wait for any other prompt. When I found him he was wounded, nothing life-threatening, but enough to put him in shock and suffering from blood loss. I brought him to the hospital and the nurse there said he was healing at an accelerated rate. I discovered the seal while removing his ruined clothing. Accelerated healing, you say? Jiraiya looked back down at the seal, fingers tracing over parts of it. Well, that explains some of the additions. These additions are for the recycling chakra. I'm guessing the other you in Naruto's world made those additions and considering the original purpose of the seal. He looked up to Minato again for confirmation. Minato leaned forward, propping his elbows on his knees and looked down at his hands. For the first time he voiced his fears. I think Naruto is a Jinchuriki. And that I think I turned him into one. Silence greeted the statement. It stretched out until Minato couldn't stand it. He looked up. Jiraiya was looking at him, posture mirroring his own. You didn't do that to him. A version of me did. That wasn't you. That was someone else, someone facing different circumstances and making different decisions. Jiraiya's voice was firm and his gaze steady. Minato wasn't sure he believed his teacher, part of him still twisted with guilt at the thought of doing such a thing to his son. Kushina had never talked much about being the Kyuubi's Jinchuriki, but he still saw the pain it put her through during her life. He would never want that type of life for his son. It still doesn't explain what happened to him when we went to see the crystal glass earlier. Jiraiya's voice drew Minato out of his thoughts before he could sink much farther, the tone thoughtful. No, it doesn't, the younger man agreed, leaning back and forcing his mind away from his darker thoughts. I've never seen a reaction like that, can't think of what might have triggered it. Could have been one of a dozen different things. Naruto's the first that I've ever heard of to travel between possible worlds, Jiraiya agreed. He rolled up the scroll containing Naruto's seal and slipped it into his bag. It could be a side effect of traveling between the two. I don't even know how to begin predicting what that would do to a human body, much less a person's mind. Perhaps we should consult Tsunade. Minato nodded, eyes roving over the bare wood floor, stopping briefly on Jiraiya's sandals by the wall. The boards needed sweeping and mopping. The whole house had been neglected for far too long. He had a feeling a large part of his life had been neglected, as well, he just hadn't noticed it until now, like the dust in the unopened rooms. Minato snorted at himself, he needed more sleep. He dragged his wandering thoughts back to the issue at hand. Then there's the period immediately before he came through that he doesn't remember. Anything could have happened in that time. Jiraiya nodded, grunting in agreement. If we could talk to the Sandaime, that would undoubtedly clear things up. But if the enemy has gained control of their tower and has access to the crystal? Minato heaved a sigh, it was only going on noon and he already felt exhausted. We won't know unless we try. There will always be some risk, the older man said. Jiraiya stood up, picking his pack up and setting it back on the bed. You're tired, and we won't be able to find out much more for now. Let's take a few hours at least to let things soak in a bit. I'm going to be staying for longer than planned, so you better have some sake downstairs or you're going to have a grumpy house guest. He tipped the bag upside down and poured the contents out onto the bedspread. Minato pushed himself up, nodding in agreement. I wonder if there's any food in the kitchen, he said out loud as he headed out the door. He'd check on Naruto, then move on to the kitchen to look at their food supplies. He couldn't remember the last time he'd gone grocery shopping, which was enough to tell him that he'd probably be stopping by the market later that day. Takeout wasn't going to be good enough for a growing boy. XXXXX, Hokage-sama, I have the report. The ANBU appeared, crouched low before Sarutobi in the table strewn with maps and papers. Proceed, the old Hokage said, never looking away from the intricate street map of Konoha's eastern quarter. Hi, the ANBU said with a slight bow of the head, the enemy has taken approximately 60% of the village. Most of the residential districts are overrun, as well as the front gate and the Hokage Tower. We have sustained heavy losses, but so have the invading forces. Most of our high-ranking shinobi are still alive and the majority is able to fight. There is no report yet on the high-ranking enemy shinobi. We have captured several Iwanin that are currently being interrogated. When we have extracted information from them we will bring it to you immediately. Very well, Sarutobi said, glancing down to the man kneeling before him. The ANBU's uniform was dirty and torn, stained with blood and dirt. Who knew how long the shinobi had been awake and fighting? Take a few hours to rest, get some food and sleep. I can still fight, Hokage-sama, the ANBU protested, stiffening at the order. Sarutobi shook his head with the wisdom of a man who had seen too many wars. You won't be any good if you collapse from exhaustion. You will fulfill your duty far better if you take the chance to rest while you can, otherwise you become a danger to your comrades. The shoulders sagged ever so slightly and the ANBU replied, Hi, Hokage-sama. There is one more observation from the front lines. The IWA forces are forming their main line of defense through the village. However, the Amigakure forces seem to be concentrating on and around the Hokage Tower. The announcement made Sarutobi pause and his frown deepen. Very well, get your rest and then prepare yourself. At nightfall we will begin our counter-offensive. The ANBU bowed low again and disappeared from the room. Sarutobi turned back to his maps, but he didn't see them. His mind was on the report he'd just received. While it was reassuring knowing his most effective shinobi were still able to carry on, it also grieved him to hear that so many of their youngest had fallen, men and women who hadn't even had a chance to live their life yet. It reminded him of the Shinobi Wars, a time he never wished to revisit in the remaining years of his life. The most disturbing news, however, was the distribution of the enemy. He had a feeling while providing the bulk of the troops for the attack, was not the true antagonist. Amigakure, in his personal opinion, was the more dangerous of the two and probably the instigator. And now they were in control of the Hokage Tower. Sarutobi's thoughts immediately turned to the crystal mirror he'd used to talk with Minato sitting in the depths of the tower. He could think of no possible way the enemy could be aware of its existence. The likelihood of them stumbling over it was even less, but aware or not, accidental discovery or not, the danger was still present. Sarutobi's mind raced to his personal notes and research, containing the seal that he had used to send Naruto through to safety. He had ordered its destruction along with the other sensitive information they could not allow to fall into enemy hands, but he hadn't been able to oversee it personally. Shaking his head, Sarutobi refocused on the maps in front of him. Shikaku, head strategist, ran through possible plans and their probability of success. He couldn't change whether or his notes had been completely destroyed. The best thing they could do now was retake the tower and push the enemy out of their strongholds. Anything else would have to come at its own time. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.